So please welcome Paul. Paul is joining us online.
Thank you, Mara. I'm not sure who the handsome young man in the photo is, but I will do my best regardless. So I think Andy is controlling the slides and will be bringing them up as we go. So if we can change to the next slide, perhaps. You can see what I really look like. Okay, cool. So first of all, as Mara indicated, this report went, we did it simultaneously with nearly every state and territory peak body, but we did sample the entire nation. We did a public survey of nearly 7,000 Australians, and we had about nearly 4,000 volunteer managers in Australia respond to our survey, and that makes it one of the largest surveys of its kind ever undertaken in the country, and it was a privilege to be a part of that. The findings of the report are based on the Queensland samples. Now, Queensland, we did a technique called oversampling, which has allowed us to do some deeper dive reports, which will be coming out in the near future. But we had 1,500 people in the public survey in Queensland and over 800 volunteer managers respond, which is just a tremendous response. Now, those 1,500 people included volunteers and non-volunteers, so it actually gave us some really interesting points of comparison, which I'll allude to as we get further in the presentation. So next one, thanks, Andy. Overall, nearly 2 out of 3 Queenslanders volunteer, which on its own is a fantastic result. That's 2.8 million people give their time either formally or informally as volunteers in the community. Next one. And on average, they spent around 21.6 hours per month giving their time, which equated to over 700 million volunteer hours in the community, which again is just a phenomenal contribution that has historically been undervalued. So whereas for those of you familiar with the previous report, it was largely focused on the economics, in this report, we took the opportunity to ask a lot more questions around volunteer behaviour, the way volunteer involving organisations work, as well as the economic piece. So there's the headline figures, but there's also a lot of data, and I'll touch on a couple of key points that came out here. So we looked at people's motivation to volunteer. For nearly 2/3 of people, it was to help others. About 2/5 of people was just for enjoyment, and for a significant percent it was to remain active. They were the top 3 reasons there. Next one. We also looked at how people find their volunteering roles. Over half of people just find it through referral, through word of mouth. More and more people, though, are starting to use social media and Google search as a mechanism. Having said that, though, there's still a place for traditional media as well, especially when you consider certain demographics and way they use media. Typically, though, people didn't just use one channel to find their volunteering opportunities. They found, between 2 or 3 to get them. Next one. We also looked at their barriers to volunteering. Specifically, we found, for 40% of people, time itself was a barrier, but a significant number of people found costs a barrier and health reasons. Now, when we break this down a little bit further in the report too, and we see significant differences between those who already volunteer, what their barriers to volunteering more are, whereas those who aren't volunteering, what their barriers might be. And I strongly encourage you to go and have a look in the report to see those differences. Next one. For volunteer managers, a couple of key findings. Again, there's a lot of data in there, but the top 3 recognition, engagement and retention strategies that they used. So 7 out of 10 organisations were using volunteer training and development as a way to motivate and continue to engage their volunteers. Nearly 2/3 looked at different forms of personal relationship building, and over half were using awards and formal recognition as a mechanism in that space. Next one. And when we looked at across a range of issues, what the top 3 challenges of the last 3 years were, Organisations observe that volunteer hours have decreased, which has come out in the data as well. That volunteers need more training, which is perhaps reflected in that training, how many organisations are using training and development. And that fewer people want to volunteer. And again, that was borne out in the report as well. So those, I guess, we've got intuitive confirmation from the sector of our findings here too. And these volunteer manager surveys were done independently of the public survey. One of the things we looked at for the first time in the report too is the differences in experience between paid volunteer managers and unpaid volunteer managers as well. And this is one point where it was noticeably acute, and it was the first time we'd actually looked at this. So to what extent do volunteer managers subsidise the cost of volunteering out of their own pocket? In other words, beyond what their organisation pays for them and the resources they use. Significantly, unpaid volunteer managers, about 22% of the cost of volunteering from volunteer involving organisations, or that they felt was paid for by themselves and not their organisation. And another big chunk for unpaid volunteer managers was actually paid by them, but later reimbursed by their organisation. And that's interesting because most people in other professional work settings, you don't have to pay for all your tools and equipment and get it reimbursed and then pay a whole heap on top of that just to do your job. So that's one of the real challenges, I think, for the sector, is how much we're asking our volunteer managers to reach into their own pockets, or not asking necessarily, but perhaps relying on volunteer managers to reach into their pockets to subsidise their activity. Next one, Andy. And we also asked, this was a really interesting question around people's future intent. Now, those of you who are familiar with the past report would have realised that volunteering has fallen off a little bit since we measured it last in about 2020, but the amount it's fallen off by is almost replaced and then some by people's future intent to volunteer. So a third of volunteer, or 30%, I should say, of volunteers intend to volunteer more in 3 years' time. And a large number of people who aren't volunteering at the moment also intend to volunteer in 3 years' time. And again, about a quarter of volunteer managers expect that people will be volunteering more again in 3 years' time for their organisation too. So even though the volume of volunteering has fallen away by around 10%, intent to volunteer has gone up sharply. So what this tells us, or something we can potentially infer from this, is that even though participation is down, it may well be a temporary blip because people want to participate more and intend to come back much more strongly than they did in the previous report. So I guess the challenge for the sector is, how do we give them the opportunity to do that? How do we enable that to them to convert their intent into reality? Cool. So next one, sorry. So yeah, the other thing we saw is that the out-of-pocket cost to volunteers themselves has gone up significantly. So it's up by over 300%. Part of this, though, maybe it's unlikely in real terms that the cost of volunteering has increased by 300% in 3 years. What's probably actually going on here is that people are much more aware of how much is going out of their pocket to support volunteering because times are a bit tougher. When times are a bit tougher, you count your pennies a bit more, you're much more aware of your spending. And that is probably a more accurate reflection of how much people are spending on their volunteering than the figure we got 3 years ago when people were theoretically better off and not tracking their spending in this space quite as much. But the other thing, though, organisations have responded. Reimbursements up by nearly 10%, nearly doubled the amount of reimbursements that organisations have been willing to give. Next one as well, Andy. Interestingly, though, as much as volunteer involving organisations do financially support people's volunteering in terms of resource enabling and things like that, 3/4 of the expense of volunteering is still borne by the volunteers themselves as individuals. So, next slide. Let's look at the benefits. If we took those 700 million hours and we replaced them with paid labour, that would cost the presumably government over $30 billion to replace that work. So that's one source of the value that's created by volunteering. If we want to enjoy the current standard of living we do, which is significantly subsidised by volunteers, and there were no volunteers, it'd cost us $30 billion to replace those services, which is significant. Next one. Next one, sorry. We also know that employers enjoy an incredible productivity boost or kick from the skills and knowledge that volunteers acquire through their volunteering. In fact, it's come back fairly strongly that about nearly 15% of a volunteer's productivity in the workplace is attributable to their volunteering, as opposed to people who don't volunteer. And that's a significant figure too. So again, if people weren't acquiring their knowledge and skills through volunteering, employers would have to pay probably about 15% of their labour cost again to train and develop employees to get these skills. So that's a tremendous free productivity boost we get. And finally, for the first time, what we've seen is that people who volunteer, as opposed to those who don't, have about a plus 4.4 percentage point boost in life satisfaction. Now, interestingly here, it didn't matter how much you volunteer, like whether you volunteer 1 hour or 100 hours a month, makes no difference or makes no statistically significant difference. Just the mere act of volunteering, when controlling for other variables, we can see gives a boost to people's well-being. And that's something we've been able to quantify. In the final slide, when we put these and a few other metrics together, we find that the value of volunteering to all Queenslanders, drumroll, here we go, is $118 billion. So that's how much value was created across all sectors of the economy, across all sectors of society in Queensland in 2023. So again, that's just the snippets, that's just the highlights, but really excited to share this finding. And I'm sure Mara can talk now more about how we use this information.
Thank you very much, Paul. And Paul will be remaining with us to be a part of the panel discussion. But as Paul has said, it's pretty impressive. I mean, even, like it shows that volunteering is falling, but to actually have the evidence base is really, really important, because we can use that really effectively to ensure that we work together to make sure that volunteering is adequately supported going forward. Alongside of the report and the summary report, the advisory committee and our team has produced an advocacy plan. Now, I don't know if they've arrived yet. Still not. They're still stuck in the truck somewhere. But here it is. You can download it from our website, but it's also, we'll also have copies that we're very happy to share. And as I said previously with the launch, the committee and our project team looked at what are some of the highlight findings of this that we can action in this immediate future. And then as we every year review that, they might change. And they identified 3 headline findings. The first one, and I should get onto my little slides. There. The first one is increasing inclusion, diversity, and access. The second one was engaging the next generation of volunteers. And the third one is enabling a positive volunteering experience. And we all know how critical each of those is. And we've heard very much from each other and from others about, engaging the next generation and all those sort of things. So in each of those, we have broken it down to look at what can we do within that in the next year and focus on it. And we'll be going out to consult with you and other volunteer involving organisations and community groups that have an interest in volunteering, and indeed businesses and government agencies, to look at whether these are kind of on point and where we can all work and what we collectively feel is important in addressing them. So when we look at the detailed insight into the key findings, when we look at the first one, increasing inclusion, diversity and access, we'll be looking at providing pathways to increase diversity, inclusion and accessibility to volunteering programs. We'll also then, and that would be irrespective of age, demographics or ability. And we've been doing a lot of work with Queensland, sort of the network of Queensland people living with disability and Third Space, Inala, and a few other groups already starting that work, which is really important to us. In that one as well, we'll be addressing the very, very critical one about not just time, not just health, but actually cost of living and looking at addressing the cost barriers to volunteering and trying to actually work with governments, not only statewide, but federally, to look at ways that we can support that and lessen that cost of living, the cost of living increases that impact on volunteering. When we look at the second one, engaging the next generation of volunteers, we will be looking at and really consulting and working with younger people to engage more young people in volunteering. We have we had a bit of a deep dive into the stats to do with youth, and that there'll be a very sort of brief report distributed during National Volunteer Week on the stats and facts, not just from Queensland, but across Australia, really, about looking at youth involvement. We'll also be looking at ensuring that there is an alignment in volunteering opportunities and the way people want to volunteer. We absolutely respect and honour and know how intense, resource intense it is for VIOs, volunteer involving organisations, to engage volunteers. With a lot of money, a lot of work is put into onboarding, recruiting, and then training volunteers. And so for us, it's quite disheartening when a volunteer kind of moves on. And of course, they have the right to do so for whatever reason. But it is kind of a real challenge when you have to invest to gain, and you gain much, much more. But we're looking at ways that we can align volunteering opportunities, flexibility in volunteering, things like that. And I know we've got Daryl, who's on our advisory committee. Daryl is with Queensland Water and Land Carers, one of the few groups that has a massive increase in volunteering since COVID. So we're going to be tapping into Daryl and his organisation to look at what are the strategies that they learned to engage not only young people, but to lower the barriers to volunteering and looking at making volunteering more attractive to people. And Daryl's group has many, many in the regions where, of course, volunteering is, the attitude there is, if not me, who else? So we find that regional volunteers do 3, 4, 5 volunteering jobs. And that's amazing. So in the next one, creating a positive volunteering experience, we will be looking at supporting volunteer managers to optimise volunteer recruitment and retention. Way, way above all others, volunteer recruitment and retention is always number one up there when we do surveys and things like that. And I always remember a dear friend of mine, her name was Susan Ellis, and some people might know her. She was a real world leader in volunteering. Sadly, she passed away a few years ago, but her mantra was, good volunteer managers make good volunteers. And so we've got to support volunteer managers, be they paid or unpaid, to actually make it easy and make them confident that to know that their volunteering practices are, compliant with national standards. And we've just relaunched the national standards to make it easier. They're all free, they're available to everybody, and we will be really pushing that. I firmly believe that if every volunteer involving organisation did national standard training, I think a lot of the things that we're facing kind of work themselves out a little. So the other thing that Volunteering Queensland will be looking at is, what's our role in this? And our role is to lead the implementation of this report and its actions, to advocate for change and really work and walk alongside the sector so that we can change together. We want to work to achieve that change. We're going to produce and commit to really high quality, consistent educational and marketing plans and resources for everyone to be able to use. And of course, further research. The research gives us that evidence base. So we'll do this through statewide consultation, surveys, and updating annually. So over the next few months, if you please keep looking at Volunteering Queensland's website, you'll see where the team travels across Queensland to work with each group. And please contact us. If you feel as though you've got a good idea or you've got some challenges, please contact us. It's really, really easy. And what is it? A problem shared is a problem solved, you know, or you'll get other kind of ways of working. Oh, no. So if I can go back to the next one, we're going to be, I've come 1, 2, yeah. It's now time to introduce our esteemed, sorry. Hopeless with technology. Okay, so with our esteemed panel, we have an apology from Dave Wimpey from Surf Life Saving, as I said. So I'd like to introduce each of our panelists and ask them to please come up here and take a seat and just help yourself. We've got 2 microphones there to share between you. So the first one is Emeritus Professor Miles McGregor-Lowndes from the Australian, or previously the Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Not-for-Profit Studies at the University of Queensland, University of Technology. Professor Lowndes, McGregor-Lowndes, OAM, is the former director of the Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Not-for-Profit Studies. He is a founding member of the ATO Charities Consultative Committee and the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission Advisory Board. Miles was awarded the Order of Australia Medal for services to the community by providing education and support in legal, financial and administrative matters to non-profit organisations. In 2023, Miles was reappointed to the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission and to their advisory board. Miles had a huge input into the Productivity Commission report 21 years ago. And then again, they had a review of it just recently. So welcome, Miles. We next have Professor Leonie Loxton-Binney, Deputy Director, Griffith Institute of Tourism, Griffith Business School, Griffith University. Leonie is the Deputy Director of the Griffith Institute of Tourism and Professor of the Department of Tourism, Sport and Hotel Management at Griffith University. Leonie's research expertise relates to volunteering, contextualized to events and tourism settings. And I don't know if anybody has recently read Leonie's co-authored report on the legacy of the Olympics, and that's something that would be very interesting to Queensland going forward. Leonie has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles. Many of these have been published in top-tier journals. She has received competitive research funding from the Australian Research Council, and Volunteering Queensland is currently working with Leonie and her team on one of those pieces of research looking at the value of volunteering in regions. So it's very, very timely that that's happening. She works with leading researchers across Australia, the UK and New Zealand, and Leonie served as a member of the State of Volunteering in Queensland Advisory Committee. Catherine Dybel. And so welcome Leonie first and welcome Catherine. So Catherine is the Director of Strategy and Engagement in the Community Services Division of the Department of Treaty, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships, Communities and the Arts. Such a long name, but nevertheless it says it all. With broad responsibility for the development and implementation of key actions under the Communities 2032 strategy. Kat's team is currently working on the development of the Queensland volunteering strategy, and we're very proud to be working with them, and also has recently launched the LGBTIQ+ strategy, a social prescribing feasibility study, and place-based work under the Stronger Communities, Stronger Places, Stronger People initiative in partnership with the Department of Social Services. Kat has extensive experience as a senior leader in the public sector, leading people and projects to deliver government programs and services, and served also as a member of our advisory committee. Dave Wimpey unfortunately can't be with us. The next one is Ricky Anderson. So Ricky is, welcome Ricky, is the Senior Manager of Services at, Senior Advisor of Services at Volunteering Queensland. Ricky led the project team on this report, so he's lived and breathed it for many, many months and driven us. She's a hard taskmaster. But Ricky has over 12 years of executive and senior management experience, focusing on strategy, change management, and improving the customer experience in volunteering. She works in both not-for-profit and for-profit organisations. Ricky has worked as a senior management roles in a range of volunteering peak bodies, including Volunteering Australia, Volunteering ACT, and now we're privileged to have her working with us at Volunteering Queensland. She has, as I said, was the project manager and co-chaired the advisory committee with the wonderful Natasha Doherty, who is a previous board member of Volunteering Queensland. And online, we have Paul Muller. And Paul, as I said, is a co-founder and director of the Institute of Project Management. And we have a long, long time relationship with Paul. Paul has worked internationally. He's done a lot of learning programs in countries looking at not-for-profit issues, educational issues and things like that. So welcome, Paul, online. I hope you'll be able to come up. So very good. So would you please welcome our wonderful panel. Slido slid in by itself without me pressing the button. But we will be using Slido. So if you have a question, please take a little snapshot of Slido, and on your phone, it'll come through. And if you tap in a question, it'll come up to our team at the back will manage that. So I'll give you just a moment to do that and move on to our questions. So the questions that I developed are a little long, but I think I tried to cover them for each person with Ricky's help. And what will appear up here on the screen is kind of like a concertinaed version of that. So our first question, I can, no? Not working, guys? Okay. Don't know if that's the first or second. Okay. All right. So this is just a snapshot of Miles's question. And the question was, the report cites volunteering as conservatively delivering $4.7 return for every $1 invested. As an esteemed researcher, leader and advocate for the Australian charities and not-for-profit and philanthropic sectors, and with your considerable input into various productivity commission committees, reports and inquiries, what stands out to you about the economic and social value that volunteering brings to our state and the investment needed to sustain and grow this productivity going forward? I'm glad you had the question early.
Thanks. Listen, first up, well done you. Well done Volunteering Queensland. It is a tremendous report.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is really quite spectacular, and yeah, we should all be very proud that here in Queensland we've got such a vibrant volunteering organisation. And I think it reflects on your board and membership, and your membership wider than that. I'd also like, while I'm in the acknowledgement frame of mind. I really, as I've been a little more time to reflect, I just want to say, well done, volunteer managers, paid and unpaid. I mean, it's like selling ice to Eskimos. You have got a tough gig with volunteers. We all know how ordinary they can be, but to manage them is just a wonderful skill.
And I think that is a round of applause for yourself.
And just to round it off, fundraisers as well. I mean, they can sell snow to Eskimos, but they're essential. So you've got all these people with difficult jobs doing their very best, and I think that really ought to be acknowledged at every opportunity, that you really you folk are doing some spectacular work under trying and difficult situations. What can you say about the economics and the numbers that have been crunched here? They really are good, and I refer you to page 10. There's a wonderful map which sets it out quite clearly that there is a huge economic impact in our state and in our community, and governments ought to have their noses drawn clearly to it at regular intervals, and particularly at budget time and in budget committees. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and I think this is a wonderful set of stats and its power to bring to attention to politicians and the general community about the economic worth, if we're talking about it in the economic frame, is spectacular. I mean, just generating 100,000 jobs is just significant, and what I hadn't realised. So it's all there, and I expect that we'll see a lot of this in submissions and reports over the next period. So it has great value in getting government to do its part. Having said that, I suspect these are an underestimate. I suspect they're an underestimate, because when I look at the ACNC register and the annual information statement that charities put in, I keep tripping over these organisations regularly, which say, how many full-time employees or effective full-time employees do you have? 0. How many volunteers do you have? 0. What's your turnover? Oh, between 80 and $100,000. Well, how can you do that without any volunteers? And when you scratch, it's often faith-based organisations are classics. They just don't get it that they fall within the definition of volunteers. And what's worse is those who are the beating heart of many organisations, the boards, the secretaries, the presidents, they don't regard themselves as volunteers either. A volunteer is somebody who comes to help from the membership and not them, and they are spending considerable time. And it's getting the message out about who falls within the definition of volunteer, which makes these figures probably an underestimate. But we know from good research that the more you talk about it, particularly in surveys, the greater will be the recognition that they are in fact volunteers, and what they do is contribute to civil society.
Thank you, Miles. And does anybody from the panel want to add to that or say something different? But thank you.
Sorry, Mara, I'll just comment on the underestimation. It's I 100% agree, it is an underestimation, and that's almost by design a little bit, because it's very important that we follow, the absolute most rigorous conservative estimates of value, so that we're not artificially inflating it in the view of policy decision makers and treasury and stuff. there's so much more value that's yet to be revealed, and there's so much more activity that's yet to be revealed. But I agree with you entirely, Miles. Like, this is, it's not necessarily tip of the iceberg in terms of underestimate, but there's so much more going on, and we've only been able to capture, you know, a chunk of it.
Thank you, Paul. So, yep. Our second question is to Leonie. And as I said previously, the late Susan Ellis said, good volunteer managers make good volunteers. Report findings evidence the benefits of both volunteers and the volunteer organisations of having a dedicated evidence the benefits of both volunteers and volunteer organisations having a dedicated volunteer manager. As a leading Australian and international researcher working in the volunteering space, do you have an opinion and any insights into this important finding, and any advice for volunteer organisations and policy and decision makers on the value of having a dedicated volunteer manager?
Thanks, Mara. The report, I think, is really fantastic for the volunteer managers in the room who might need to advocate within your organisations for the value of your role, which is really very much pivotal, fundamental to managing volunteers, ensuring that they have a successful, satisfactory experience with your organisation. You know, volunteer managers are at the heart of that. So ensuring, of course, that, you know, you're a focal point for communications with volunteers, but also a focal point for advocating within your organisations for the value of volunteers and why volunteers are central to the remit and the success of your own organisations. That's probably something that in the past has been taken for granted, I think, but certainly greater recognition of the central role of volunteer managers as that focal point, as the advocate, as the person who knows the volunteers the most, can tailor roles accordingly, can you know, really focus on the needs of the volunteer. There is a mention in the report about how small gestures are really important in terms of rewards. So the volunteer manager who knows their volunteers very well can do that, as opposed to grand gestures, which might not necessarily sit well with the volunteers. So the central hub for all of this, the volunteer manager, is vitally important.
Yeah. And I hope that everybody has joined our Leaders Volunteering Network now. So we really want to bring together the leaders in our volunteer management area so that you can learn from one another and mentor one another going forward. We also, the role of the volunteer manager is critical. So anybody wish to comment on that? We'll go to the third question, which is to Kat. So, Kat, this report is released at a critical time and coincides with the development of a Queensland volunteering strategy. Are there key findings that will help shape the strategy and its action plan, and how volunteering is advanced going forward, particularly with the report indicating a number of clear barriers to volunteering, as well as the strong intent of Queenslanders to volunteer more?
Excellent. Thank you. I'm actually going to start by echoing Miles's comments about the quality of the State of Volunteering report, and really congratulate Volunteering Queensland on investing in doing the work and the quality of the outcome of that. The first report that was released a couple of years ago, and I think this comment might have been made earlier today, was actually one of the key drivers for the reason the development of a volunteering strategy is included as an action in the Community's 2032 action plan. So this report, this latest report, and the last one are just really essential evidentiary bases that will inform the development of the strategy. One of the first things that you do when you're developing any strategy is a whole pile of environmental scanning and research and all of those sorts of things. And this report is a critical source. So I just wanted to acknowledge that first. In terms of the role of the strategy and looking at the findings from it, yeah, there are very, very clear identifiable barriers, and also really want to call out that concerning trend towards reduction in volunteering participation and availability of hours. Obviously, that is something that is a concern. And so when we look at what the role of government is and what the role of the strategy is, it really is about looking at those broad-based themes about why is volunteering important. Everybody in this room knows that to be the case, and you can call out those very specific economic benefits to community. The interest of the Department of Communities, because of that connection to the inquiry into social isolation and loneliness, because of its connection to the Communities 2032 strategy, we have more or less a multi-layered interest in this. So we are very interested in the investment in volunteering as both a benefit to community and to community services and the running of civilization, I suppose, broadly, but also what people get back from that and its opportunities to really speak to and benefit and offset some of the more adverse impacts of social isolation and loneliness, which is a long way of saying that the strategy has multiple levers in it and multiple interests in it. One of the things that we'll be looking to achieve through the strategy is looking at the current state, looking at what the evidence is telling us. And I think the way that I like to frame this is that source of data that's coming from the State of Volunteering report is giving us a whole pile of what information, what we're hearing, what do we know, and a little bit of that why. It's not a comprehensive deep down dive into why, and I know VQ are doing some work with specific cohorts to understand some of those whys, but the sector engagement that we are undertaking at the moment and with cross-government partners and Commonwealth partners as well is to really be trying to understand and unpack, well, why is this the case? What are the policy drivers that have contributed to that situation or at least failed to address it? And how might we work together more effectively in designing a strategy and some of those more strategic levers to hopefully arrest that decline and ideally turn it around? What things might be put in place to achieve that? In the time that I have been working in this space, of course, the topic of funding comes up routinely, and I will acknowledge that as an elephant in the room. But the other thing that I would like to say is it is far more complicated than that and complex than that. And there's a myriad of things that you can do just in terms of putting in place alignment of purpose, role clarity, very clear objectives in moving forward, and really making it so that government is clear in aligning its investment and what those targeted outcomes should be. So there's a lot of work to be done. We are very active in that space, and I'd also like to thank everybody in the room who has already participated in some of the sector engagement that we're doing. We have a bit more to go, but yeah, certainly, as I said, in terms of headline items, the declining rate of volunteering is concerning, and also those economic barriers to participation and those time barriers to participation. Again, it was mentioned this morning, the cost of living impacts. Those are complex challenges for government, more than just the Department of Communities. Those are very complex systemic issues and need to be seen as part of a greater whole. But nevertheless, I think there's work to be done in this space. And the timing in terms of the Commonwealth Government released a strategy, they're now actively working on an action plan. The Queensland Government is currently working on the development of a youth strategy. We've got the Communities 32 strategy and now the volunteering strategy. You're hearing the word strategy a lot. So, which is just a way of saying, I think at a government level, at a whole of government level, the landscape is in the right place for us to really capitalise on some of these opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kat. And I think the two pieces of work, the strategy and the State of Volunteering report, together they're very powerful. Yes. And I'm hoping our word for 2023 was synergy. Try and find synergy across in our organisation. But again, I hope that we do find lots of synergies that support both of those. And I want to say thank you for consulting with us in terms of the strategy as well. So the next question is, if I can So this is a question to Ricky. And the question is, the cost of volunteering has risen by 300% for volunteers. And the cost is identified by volunteers as the second highest barrier to their volunteering. How does the Volunteering Queensland plan to mitigate this going forward?
Thanks, Mara. This is a really important one for us to address, and I think Paul said it very nicely in his presentation, where it's not necessarily just a 300% increase, but people may be citing how they're spending their money a lot more tightly at the moment, given the environment that we're in. So I think that's an important point to make. When we're looking at the barriers to volunteering, it was the second biggest barrier to volunteering more was cost. But the second biggest barrier to volunteering for non-volunteers was that they hadn't been asked. So I think when we're looking at cost as a barrier, we've got to look at it in its entirety. And there's a real opportunity for non-volunteers, for all of us to say, hey, maybe we need to be doing more to be asking those people to volunteer, and, you know, what else can we be doing? And it's certainly something that we as Volunteering Queensland are acknowledging and is reflected in our action plan to look at how we can get the message out there to ask those people a little more. When it comes to cost, and we look at the breakdown of cost, it was around food and beverages for when people were volunteering, the transport to get there. I was on ABC radio this morning, and a caller named Pamela called in and was talking about, for a few volunteering roles she was doing, she goes, just the cost of fuel for me to get in there to volunteer. So it's really looking at all of those out-of-pocket expenses that people incur. I think it's an important thing, and it's an important finding, because it is something that is a systemic thing that we can look at how we can address. Featured in Volunteering Queensland's budget submission and in our advocacy plan was looking at, is there an opportunity to have a centralised reimbursement fund that organisations could tap into to try and reimburse some of these funds? Because we are aware that this increase in the cost of everything is really impacting not-for-profits and volunteer-involving organisations too. So we think that the solution has to be multifaceted. We need to look at, when we're developing a volunteering program, it's not free. We've been banging on about it for a long time, but it's really important that we all acknowledge that it's not free. We need to look at how we can budget for it appropriately around not only the management of it, not only just the reimbursement of things like people's uniforms, but considering that cost as a barrier for how much is it going to cost someone to get here, and all of those things as well. Pamela also talked about, I don't have internet and I have to do all my training online. So if I have to get the internet to do that, I can't afford it. So all of those things are kind of a wicked problem, but for us to consider when we're budgeting, but really, really important. So we're going to do some work to make sure that people have the tools to be able to budget effectively. We're going to continue to advocate for things like a centralised reimbursement fund, because we all have programs that are there that probably don't have the budget that they require as well. And then there's other systemic things that we're going to continue to hope and wish for, things like tax subsidies for volunteers, which would be a wonderful thing that will continue to work with our counterparts at Volunteering Australia and other peak bodies as well. So I think one of the biggest things when we look at this report and our advocacy plan is all of the things that we want to address, not one person's responsible for. We've got to take a multi-pronged approach and work together. So I think that's why it's really important that we look at, partnering on the strategy, even with QCOS on they've got a campaign around the cost of living, making sure that we've got the evidence. So working together on this is going to be really, really critical.
Thank you, Ricky. And can we just come back to Paul, please? Well, and Paul, your question is, back in 2022, you predicted that there would be a continued decline in volunteering rates. This report has found a 10% decrease in the rate of volunteering across Queensland. Is this consistent with what's been happening nationally and indeed globally? And what do you think has caused this decline? And also, have you got any solutions that you can sort of let us know about?
No, thanks, Mara. Yeah, look, if you're a volunteer manager or an organisation that's involving volunteers, You've got an awful amount of discretion in terms of, you know, what strategies you employ, what tactics you use to recruit, retain, you know, engage volunteers, recognise and reward them. But there's some things that are outside of your control too. And to be honest, the playing field is starting to tilt against you. So there's a few things, like as an economist, we look at things in terms of demand and supply. On the demand for volunteering services side, that's increasing just from a number of factors that are actually largely outside our control, especially at the organisational level. So first of all, we've got the ageing population. As we say, demographics is destiny. So the older the population gets, we know that older Australians, older Queenslanders are quite heavy consumers of volunteer services. They use a lot of volunteer services, right from Meals on Wheels through to palliative care support, companionship and support. There's an awful lot of volunteers engaged in that sector. If we increase the number of older people, we need more volunteers in that space to give people the quality of life as they age. Climate change is another thing that's actually going to have a big impact on volunteering, on the demand for volunteering services. As our infrastructure just isn't built for our future climate in Queensland, and as we have more cyclones, fires, droughts and floods, that's going to, and they become more frequent and more acute, that's going to place demand on services, not just in terms of emergency first response type services, but in terms of that rebuild and recovery, again, heavily dependent on volunteers to contribute there. We've also got general economic hardship, which we've spoken about a fair bit today. So the more people who are experiencing hardship, and we know from the data, that not the data in this report, but ABS data and data out there generally, that there are more people slipping below the poverty line. There's more people in need of food bank support, op shop support, breakfast clubs at schools, and homelessness services. So those, as our economy becomes tougher, especially at the edges, that's going to increase the demand for services. So we need more volunteers, is one thing. But the trouble is, all of these people who are falling into this space now where they're demanding the services, whether they're aging, whether they're vulnerable to climate change, whether they're vulnerable to economic hardship, they're people now who can't volunteer. So we're increasing the number of people who can't volunteer just by virtue of this increased demand, which again places pressure on the volunteers, who again potentially leads them to burnout and withdraw their services as well. So that's starting to impact the supply of volunteers, number of volunteers we have available. Other things too that have been mentioned, like, the cost of volunteering. When your budget gets tight, it's not like you can pay, you can choose to pay 2/3 of your rent to save money, or you can send the kids to school 3 days a week instead of 5 to save money. Those essential, what we call non-discretionary expenditure, they're kind of fixed. So if your fixed budget is locked in, your discretionary budget goes down. And unfortunately, volunteering for most people is a discretionary activity. So if you have less money to if you have 10% less purchasing power because of inflation over the last 2 years, it's not like you can reduce your overall budget by 10%. What you have to do is just drop things altogether. So it might only be a marginal effect, but it's the increase in inflation and lack of relative purchasing power, but it actually prevents people volunteering altogether, and they withdraw their services. Other things too for organisations, climate change is increasing the cost of insurance a lot across a whole different spaces. The way insurers cover their costs is by distributing the risk. So all policies rise regardless of whether you're affected by climate change or not, and they rise disproportionately to cover the cost of things like climate change. So we're going to wear that impact at one level in volunteer involving organisations. We've got other demographic factors too, like the urbanisation of our societies. People living more in one-person homes, have less capacity to volunteer because they're not sharing household tasks. People moving from the country to the city means less people left behind to help out and enable those sort of essential services, whether it's sporting participation, maintaining community infrastructure, service delivery to older people, etc. the price of iron ore affects volunteering. Like as China collapses, we're less able to sell iron to China. There's a big chunk of our tax base gone. Australia's probably going to, from a budgetary point of view, this is probably the last surplus we can expect for a while. When budgets fall into deficit, we're also intentionally decreasing our migrant numbers, which again, they've been a big tax base for us that has enabled our continued growth and prosperity over the years. Government's going to have less money. When government has less money, they tighten up, and they volunteering again kind of fits in a discretionary space for government. So there's more competition for resources in that space. When governments get tight, businesses get tight as well. So there's less philanthropy going on. There's less donations to volunteer involving organisations. The causes become, and there's a redirection of philanthropy. So the money that I might have given to a local homeless charity, when I see there's a big bushfire or climate change emergency, I'll divert my money to that because I've only got a limited amount of money that I can give either as an individual or an organisation. So we're confronted with two really big challenges here. The demand for volunteering services is naturally going to increase. There's no question from an economic demographic point of view that's happening, which means we have to redistribute resources somehow or increase the supply of resources to make it work. But the other problem is we're going to have less volunteers or less people in the pool of available volunteers to call on to solve these or to address these issues. So you asked me if I can solve it too, Mara. That's a big one. That's probably beyond the scope of my magic wand. But what I would say at the organisational level, what you can do is you can have a look at the demographic profile of your volunteers. And there's a section on this in the State of Volunteering report. And you can say, who's unrepresented here? Are we missing youth? Are we missing people living with disability? Are we missing older people? Whatever that demographic is, and say, okay, what is it that we can do to increase participation in our organisation and these demographics? It's no longer a case of just advertising a volunteering role and saying, come and fill this role and help these people. You really need to be a lot more targeted, I think, in your messaging. And you need to be speaking probably about the thing that we often overlook. What are you going to get out of it as a volunteer? What's the benefit to you as an individual? We don't like to speak about it in volunteering so much because, I guess there's an essential humility to the act of volunteering. But I think if we're operating at the organisational level in a space where we're competing for volunteers, what we really need to be clever about in our messaging is making it tailored to the audiences that we specifically want to target and that we have direct underrepresentation in. And also promote, hey, volunteering makes you feel good. You make friends, you make social connections, you're active, it really is enjoying and rewarding to you as an individual. And that message, I think, probably hasn't been hit hard enough in previous efforts, especially if we can tailor it to the demographics we're missing. So thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you so much. And I think the one thing that came out very clearly was ask. It's really interesting when we look at, and it's consistently been the case for about 2 decades that I've been involved, is what's the way that people volunteer most? A family member volunteers or their friend asks them. So, and then what are we hearing from non-volunteers?
Well, that voluntold sometimes, Mara.
But it's seeing what a great experience they had and just going along and buddying up. So if if that's the way that they primarily volunteer, then encourage your volunteers to bring a buddy along or something like that. And I'm sure everybody's doing that. But the other thing that's interesting is that's the way people volunteer most. And on the other side, non-volunteers are saying, nobody asked me, which is kind of like you go, wow, okay. We kind of say, well, oh gosh, what more can we do? But really it is asking, eyeballing people and asking them. I'm just going to put up our Slido again, but I'm just going to pass, because, oops, sorry, Linda. We've got 2 more things. One is the Slido, and I'm going to pass over to Simone, one of our staff members, to see if there were any questions from the floor or the internet.
Yes, thank you. Oh, that's good. So the first one's for Paul. Paul, I'm not sure that you answered this in your last response. It was, do the Queensland results align with trends in other states?
Yeah, absolutely. There's, sort of minor significant variance, but most of the variances are within what we'd call the margin of error. So, it's sort of, no survey of 1,500 people is perfectly representative of the population. But when we compare the Queensland results to the national results or what's happening in the other states, yeah, there is almost, I won't say perfect alignment. Every state has its own unique results. But yeah, what we're seeing in Queensland is consistent with the other states. But interestingly, as we're starting to do these deep dives, I think Kat was speaking about the need to ask the why, and I've been fortunate enough to be part of that process too. The reasons that I've done a couple in 3 states. I've done a few in 3 states now, and the reasons are all subtly different and informed by the context of the state as well. So I think that's, as was said, is really important work going forward, because I think there are definite regional differences, not just in terms of Queensland as a whole, but the experiences, the experience of someone in Cunnamulla versus Brisbane is going to be very different. So the experience of a young person versus an older person is going to be very different. And I think that's where there's a real opportunity to identify opportunities to make a difference.
Just while I'm still on you, another question about whether the report addresses the nuances of remote and different types of volunteering. So we had a question particularly from North Queensland, but have we dug into the stats as they pertain to the regions of Queensland?
Yeah, so we've best been able to do this at the national level. So for the nerds in the room like me, our sample sizes from regional and remote Queensland are too small to make direct observations about Queensland as a whole. But what we've been able to do is look at the data, the national data set, and do a technique called regression analysis to actually say, okay, what is it about regional and remote, regional, rural, and remote living that is different about how volunteers behave? And there are some interesting results in there. I won't try and cite them off the top of my head, but we're looking at things like motivations different, participation different, and barriers different. And definitely there were some things that were observable and notable in the regions that were more acutely felt than in the metro areas.
And thank you, Paul. And I was just wondering whether Leonie could comment because of the piece of research we're doing. And if Miles, I'm not sure if you have any experience.
Thank you. Just following on, so we are working with Volunteering Queensland on a 4-year national project specifically looking at rural volunteering. So we're very interested in mapping the supply and demand of volunteers. So where are the volunteers based? Where are the organisations based? Does that align, or are there shortages? And we suspect there are significant shortages in some rural regional areas. This project is very much still in train, but it's a very important project because for all the reasons we just heard from Paul, and for those of you based in the region seeing this firsthand, the fact that volunteers are so fundamentally important to delivering essential services, but also additional discretionary services as well. And we're seeing significantly probably at the more extreme end in terms of the demographic changes with ageing population, out-migration of younger populations. So, the living in the regions, the volunteers in the regions, it's not just about volunteering, it's really about the sustainability of rural and regional communities in Australia going forward.
Thank you. It's always interesting, like Mary Lou, where are you? She might not be here. She might have gone back. I did a training tour with Mary Lou from Queensland Water and Land Carers. We had a partnership. Mary Lou and I went out to a number of very small organisations, very small towns. And when we did that, which is about 4 years ago, Daryl, the attitude was, if not me, who else? And I can. What we're hearing now is, I'm tired. you know, and so it's a really interesting, I don't know where the tide comes from, whether it's just a life's journey or post-COVID, or we've learned a different way of living where it's much more quieter. I don't know, but I still really admire that, if not me, who else, and that can-do attitude that's that was very strong in regions. Any more questions, Simone? We'll have one last one. I'm sorry, lunch is beckoning.
One that's quite popular and I don't know who it's for, so apologies. Will the ATO consider giving volunteers a tax refund, deduction or rebate for their expenses or travel costs?
I can tell you straight up, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, like that's just not remotely on the government's radar, mainly because it's ridiculously difficult to police. How do you protect the integrity of a system like that? So yeah, having said that though, the tax system is the way, that's the sort of biggest tool that government has at its disposal to incentivize behaviour. So, you know, I think what Ricky and VQ are proposing in terms of a fund, a reimbursement fund that organisations can apply to, that's one of the best solutions I've kind of heard about in that respect. You know, other things, you know, that have been proposed is, you know, GST exemptions and things like that, fiddling at the edges. But there's nothing, I don't think, that the government is willing to do to directly address the problem of volunteering costs in terms of reimbursing directly volunteers or making things tax deductible. Unfortunately, that one won't be coming anytime soon.
Miles, would you like to add anything to that?
Just to say that it's not the ATO, it's the government, and the government should tell the ATO what to do.
Oh.
The second thing is that it's not beyond the realms of possibility. For example, in Canada, they've just had their budget and they've doubled their contribution to volunteer expenses through the tax system that they have there, the input tax credits. So it is possible. It is possible to do it without involving great tax abuse openings, and I think it should be on the agenda. And again, you've got to put it on the agenda, and you're in a good spot to do that with the report that you've got.
People backing us like you guys, it is on our agenda, and Volunteering Australia is leading that. The other one that's on the agenda, which I'm really a strong advocate for, is national insurance for volunteers. Because in all my experience, there have been very, very few insurance claims from any volunteer. And the other thing is that if other countries can do it, we should be able to as well. And I know one of the Nordic countries has, that a few years ago, they paid equal to 29 Australian dollars, and you could then volunteer for X numbers of organisations. 2 local government authorities across Australia said, if the volunteer involving organisation goes to the state peak, then, and is accredited by the state peak, it's not mandatory, but it's just an accreditation, then it would get insurance that was paid for by the local government authority. And local government know their communities best. They have to be a strong partner along with state government and federal government in progressing volunteering going forward. Look, I'd like to say thank you. I'm sorry we've held you up for lunch. Just while I ask Linda, our chair of our board, to come up and say, oh, sorry, Linda, you've gone. May I just say a couple of things that we have on